My talk will have four main parts. So first I want to say a little bit about what's involved in understanding the natural world. I'll put forward a traditional theory and then I'll critique it in various ways. Secondly, I want to take up the question of what it might mean to understand people. So already making this distinction is controversial because according to some views, the way in which we understand the natural world is just we understand people along the very same lines. That might be a view that is called, say, a unity of science view or a unity of understanding view. I want to dispute that view and say that there is something distinctive epistemically about understanding other people. Now, in keeping with the idea of the conference, which again I think is just a fascinating and deeply important question, I want to take up the issue of how the humanities, especially literature, I'm going to touch a little bit on philosophy. I have lots of thoughts about the nature of history and how that might contribute to our understanding, but I'm not going to get to it in this talk. So how the humanities might enrich our understanding. And then I'm going to make a claim which is controversial in a way just because it sounds very old-fashioned, that studying the humanities might be especially important for achieving or acquiring wisdom. Again, it's old-fashioned. People don't really talk about wisdom as much these days. And I think it's very interesting to think about why. So the first part about understanding the natural world. Again, I'll sketch out a view which in large part I think is true. The problem is that I think it's limited even when it comes to understanding the natural world. So here's the view which I think is true. I've defended it myself in the past, but also I think is kind of limited. So here's the intuition. That when you understand something, you understand how it hangs together. So we could put this in kind of picture thinking like this. Think of the objects of understanding as networks or systems or structures of some kinds. And that when you understand that network or system or structure, you understand or you grasp how its various elements depend upon and relate to each other. So the network could be something like, or the system could be something like quantum mechanics. It could be the American Civil War. It could be the Chinese government. These are all examples of, say, systems or networks with various parts that depend upon and relate to each other. And when you understand, you grasp in some way that whole. You figure out how they work. Now, as an epistemologist, I don't know exactly what the background is of all of you, but it's tempting to think of this as a distinctive epistemic goal, especially when you contrast it with another kind of epistemic goal, the goal of knowledge. So knowledge, at least in principle, can be very atomistic. If understanding was holistic, was oriented towards systems, networks, knowledge can be very piecemeal. So I could tell you that my middle name is Stephen, or that I was born in New Jersey. And you would just come to know those isolated bits of knowledge, propositional knowledge. If I'm going to convey my understanding to you, that will involve something more systematic, more holistic. It's hard to pass along my understanding in these discrete, atomistic ways, in the way you could pass along knowledge. So understanding is holistic, often having to do with subject matters. Mind you, though, we often are going to give an example to illustrate what I have in mind. We don't just talk about understanding subject matters, we talk about understanding events, but even those events are connected events. They're events which appeal to causes. So I'll give you an example of what I have in mind. So imagine I'm sitting at a coffee shop, and let's say Renee is sitting next to me, at the table next to me, and I'm kind of daydreaming and looking in your direction, and I see you get up from your table, your knee bumps the table wobbles, and the coffee in your cup spills. Now I take it all of us would almost automatically, and in fact I think automatically, understand why the coffee in your cup spilled, namely because your knee hit the table. So we could think of this in a way as this, we don't think in these terms, but you could, as what we do naturally in those cases is that we pick out dependence relations. You might think of that as causal relations, but I actually like the notion of dependence because it might be a broader notion than the notion of a cause. So, and we could think of the different factors at play in this situation. We could assign them variables that might take on different values. So let me just spell it out. Again, this is a very simple example to get your mind around it. So let's say the S stands for the contents of the cup. It could take on two values as I'm thinking about it. It could be spilled or not spilled. So we're trying to think in that situation, what is it that made the difference between these contrasts? What is it that led to the spill versus not spilling? And there are a number of things going on. Again, it could have been the time of day that made a difference. It could have been the music in the background that made a difference. It could be the color of the cup that made the difference. But none of those things intuitively, we just automatically rule those out. You know, was it raining outside or not? Those are variables, at least in the environment, but we rule those out as causal factors, as real relations of dependence, and we automatically hit upon the knee as the thing that made the difference. So we establish this little network of dependence between the position of the knee and the cup. Again, that's just obvious. We do it automatically, but I think this has important implications. Because this, I think of as a little mini structure. So here's a structure, a relation of dependence between the position of the knee and the spilling of the cup. And we could think in terms of larger structures. So I just put up, this is just a dummy kind of diagram. It could stand for anything, and I put up, say, the US House of Representatives. It could be the structure of a cell. It could be some kind of physical system. It could be, you know, the way your Macintosh works in front of you. So for any system like that, I suggest you could map out these relations of dependence. So what this map would say, that if you were to say, wiggle the p variable and keep the rest constant, then the q variable will wiggle. If you wiggle the y variable, then the q variable is not going to wiggle. But if you keep the rest constant, then the x variable will be. So I think we're doing this all the time, and I think this is what science largely does. It tries to track these relations of dependence. So these relations of dependence, you might think of them as mapping out structure. Now, so this theory, I'm indebted in large ways to a philosopher of science at the University of Pittsburgh, James Woodward, who worked this out in great sophistication. And one thing that he says it allows you to do is that when you grasp these relations of dependence, you're able to answer what if things had been different questions. So if you grasp that there's a real relation of dependence between the position of your knee and the contents of the cup, you grasp that if you wiggle this variable and keep the rest constant, this will wiggle. If you change the time of day or the music on in the background, wiggle that variable, this variable is not going to wiggle. There's not a relation of dependence between them. And again, I think what science is doing, largely through controlled experiments, is trying to figure out these relations of dependence. And I think that allows you to answer these what if things had been different questions. So it allows you, as it were, to peer into not just how things are, but how things would be if there were certain changes. And just to add to that, Woodward says that one of the great practical appeals to science then is that it, as it were, puts you on the controls potentially of the world. Why would we be very interested in science on this model? Because of the tremendous possibility of manipulation that it offers. If you know how the various variables of the world are related, then this potentially gives you enormous power to control outcomes. So I think this is a very powerful picture. Essentially, I think it's a picture of understanding as grasping structure, grasping dependence relations, grasping causal relations. But I also think we could ask, is this all there is? At one point, I thought this was all there is, and there are still important philosophers who think that this is the essence of understanding. So this is the renowned American philosopher Linda Zagzebski. So Zagzebski's theory of understanding in a forthcoming paper is basically what I was just laying out. She says, I propose then that understanding is the grasp of structure. When we grasp an object structure, we understand the object. And as I say, I used to think this too, and I don't think that it's wrong. I think that if you were to give me a structure, I think the way that I would understand it would be to grasp the relations of dependence kind of contained in that structure. But I've come to think that it's limited. And it's limited in an important way, and when we see this, I actually think this leads to important implications about the humanities. So, what kind of gave me pause? Well, I'll just biographically, so I was at Cambridge this year, and I was on sabbatical, and I was talking to a graduate student in philosophy at Cambridge, and I was putting forth this understanding as grasp of structure view, and he said, no, understanding is wider than that. And then I ripped this little piece of paper in front of us, and I said, it's just supposed to be just an arbitrary bit, right? And I said, listen, can you understand that? Can you understand that thing? And I wanted him to say, no, you can't understand it because there's no real system of relations here. There's no real, it's structured, but it's not a structure. Like I could just arbitrarily keep ripping it. I could arbitrarily take some cubic bit of atmosphere here and I say, is this a structure? And I say, again, it has structure, but I would say it's not a structure because it's not kind of systematically related in a contained way. Zagzebski, for instance, thinks that these things wouldn't be structures because I don't think she would think they have a unity. But talking to this graduate student convinced me that, yes, there is a way in which you would understand even a little bit of paper like this, or even if I took an arbitrary bit of the carpet. I think, I'm not sure that's a structure, but I think that I can understand it. And what would that involve? I think that I would understand something like this. Well, when I understand, what it's capable of. So if I, eat it, would it nourish me? If I put a match to it, would it burn? If I were to put it into water, would it float? If I were to put it on top of a piece of, another piece of paper, would it be heavy enough to act as a weight? So there are things I think I understand about that piece of paper. And when you think about it, as I say, I understand what it's capable of, how it might react if various things were to happen to it. If you want to talk in terms of old school metaphysics, you might say I understand something like its powers, what it can do. And as I was getting more kind of comfortable with that idea or thinking about it, it occurred to me that if you've seen this movie with Amy Adams, Arrival, it's a very good movie, but lots of science fiction movies are predicated on an idea like this. Something comes down from outer space and people are like, what is this? And what they could mean something like, how is it structured? But I think they really mean something more practical. What is this thing going to do? If we try to light it on fire, what's going to happen? If we drop it out of a building, what's going to happen? If you think indeed of you're walking through the forest and you find some mysterious plant. If you don't understand it, you don't understand things like, is it going to poison you? Again, can you eat it? Can it make you healthy? You don't understand, as it were, the powers of the plant. But if you become familiar to it through acquaintance, you can come to understand the plant. You can come to understand these mysterious things. Now, I submit that you were understanding that, so visually thinking, it gives you a picture like this. That there are some things that are structures, and when you understand them, you understand how their different elements are depend upon and relate to each other. But we can also talk about more discreetly about understanding things, like this piece of paper, or like a mysterious thing you would find in the forest, or something that came out from outer space. And what understanding that thing amounts to, I suggest, is that you get a sense of its capacities, its powers, what it's capable of. Or if we want to add picture, if you were to try to impact it in various ways, how it would react. Now, you might think that this fits the structure model, but I don't think it obviously fits the structure model. In fact, the thing that I think it's more akin to is, so I'm not an expert on Heidegger at all, but if you know Heidegger a bit, so I take it there's this idea of projecting possibilities onto the world. So you come across things, and again, you understand the hammer when you understand how it can be used, the various ways in which it could be implemented. And I don't think that's obviously a matter of grasping structure. That's a matter of, what does this thing do? What can we do with it? What are the possibilities that it affords? Okay, now you might think that these are just two disparate ways of thinking about understanding. Understanding as grasping structure and understanding as projecting possibilities. But I actually want to suggest that there's a uniform way we could think of it. It sounds fancy, it sounds like philosopher lingo to begin with, but I'll try to break it down. So my proposal for a unified account of understanding is that understanding involves cognitive control. This is actually a phrase I got from Alison Hills at Oxford, who writes about understanding. Cognitive control of the relevant modal space. So modality, when philosophers talk about it, just means having to do with possibility and necessity. So the modal space around this structure of like the US House of Representatives or a cell, that would tell you, again, how these variables are connected, and that if you were to change the values of the variables this way, this would lead to different changes. That, I take it as having control of the modal space in the sense that you're able to answer these what if things have been different questions. I like thinking of modality because I actually think there's an important level of understanding that's tied to grasping necessities. But I also think it's, so just to make it, I don't think it would go too wrong to say that that understanding involves cognitive control of possibility spaces. Possibility spaces, again, the structure could be something like a cell, it could be a physical system, it could be something with many more parts. And I think that when you understand something like the hammer, or the piece of paper, or anything which, as it were, you have some grasp of, you can make sense of, again, you can project possibilities onto it. You have a sense of what it can do, how it would react to various inputs. Okay, so what I want to say, tentative conclusions for part one, is that understanding is concerned with possibility spaces. Structure expresses these possibilities in one way, but I don't think that's the only way in which we could get a handle on possibility spaces. Sometimes I think about it like, think of the nodes in those graphs, the dependence maps. I think sometimes what I think is like this. Those nodes themselves, they're maybe the basis of understanding the structure. The nodes are the things where you have real powers and capacities, elements that can take on different values. And then the structure is, as it were, built on those powers and capacities. But that would suggest, again, at least two layers of understanding. Understanding based on the nodes, what things can do, and then understanding based on how the nodes relate. That's what I'm thinking in terms of the possibility spaces. And I should also say, as we gain greater understanding, our cognitive control of these spaces increases. So you could have a very naive view about why the cup spilled, because it was hit by the knee. But then you could get a more elaborate physical story involving equations and generalizations and maybe laws, which would allow you greater cognitive control. Okay. So that's my sketch of a theory about understanding. It's concerned with possibility spaces, that our understanding increases as our control of these possibility spaces increase. I want to say that that's right for the natural world, and I want to make the case that understood in a certain way, it's actually right for people too, but you need to understand it in the right way. I say understanding people, but in a longer version of this, understanding cultures, human artifacts. I wonder whether, I'm not sure, but so I'm becoming very interested in, say, hermeneutics, understanding texts, works of art, buildings, human artifacts more generally, whether we could say something similar. Okay, so here are a few questions for this section. Is there anything distinctive about understanding human beings? And then a second question would be, is there anything distinctive or irreplaceable? Is there some kind of understanding you could only get of human beings via the humanities, via the study of literature or philosophy or history? I'm kind of dubious about that necessity claim. I don't think they're strictly necessary. I think almost any epistemic good I can think of with respect to human beings, I can get without the study of literature or without the study of history. Just epistemic good kind of as a type. I could say more about that. Obviously, to understand, say, ancient Greek culture, you have to use historical means. But I'm not sure there's a distinctive kind of understanding there. I could say more about that. Okay, but let's turn to this first question about what's distinctive about understanding human beings. So you might think that when it comes to the question, is there anything distinctive about understanding human beings, the answer is just no. This would be something like the unity of science view. Because when you think about it, you could think that understanding human beings essentially is just understanding people's psychologies. And our psychologies are systems or structures of a sort. I have beliefs and desires and hopes and fears and loves. And these hopes and desires and fears and loves are all systematically related in different ways. So you might think that when it comes to understanding human beings, it's just the same story about understanding the natural world. It's a matter of grasping relationships, dependencies. It's a matter of grasping relationships and dependencies among things like beliefs and desires and hopes and fears. But still, it's not that different. But I want to at least push against that. I do think that there's a great deal of understanding that you can get from, think of this as the point of view of a psychologist trying to understand you. There can be just, again, enormous gains in understanding from that third person point of view. But I guess I'm trying to think of a case where, suppose someone came from like a far corner of the universe, and they were extremely smart, and they could chart everything about your beliefs and desires and hopes and fears. They became experts in your psychology. So they could predict what you're going to do beautifully well, flawlessly. I still feel, so there's part of me, this, I guess, humanistic part of me, which thinks that even though someone could predict flawlessly how I'm going to behave based on the study of my psychology, there'd be some kind of understanding that would elude them. Now, this is, I'm not the only one who thinks this. This is actually this is a big fault line in the philosophy of social sciences. Other people who would say, just don't read it yet, would say, no, there's something, the traveler from another part of the universe who just looked at you and studied you like a system would be missing out on something. I'm going to say, just roughly, they'd be missing out on what it's like from your perspective, from the first person perspective. So just some of the most famous names in this way of thinking, people like Vico and Herder, Dilthey, Collingwood. This would be the thought, so Dilthey has a famous line that we explain nature, but we understand the life of the soul. This would be the thought in especially the continental tradition, that there's a big distinction between verstehen and erklären. Erklären is what the natural sciences do. It kind of trucks in explanations, predictions, laws, causes. But there's something else that, when it comes to human beings, that this falls short. And we don't just want to explain it. The idea is we want to understand it. Now, part of this is, I think, related to a question that Renee touched on about if you're trying to think of what it is that's distinctive about the humanities, one important question is, does it have any distinctive objects? What is the distinctive subject matter? And according to these thinkers, at least, the distinctive subject matter is something like the life of the soul. Only this is really amenable to understanding. I'm going to give you one more person. So Isaiah Berlin, when he was writing a book about Vico and Herder, he didn't endorse this, but he kind of succinctly put their idea like this. He said, we observe, we learn facts about, but we cannot understand things like stones or stars or the Deathwatch Beetle. Now, I think he's there. So again, he's speaking as a representative of this Verstehen school of thought. In a way, we're trying to represent their views. But what he's saying is that there's a distinctive kind of understanding you can't even get of like stones or the Deathwatch Beetle. And I'm fascinated by this idea, but I wonder what he means. So okay, let me try to get the Deathwatch Beetle. That's the Deathwatch Beetle. In a way, maybe you can't understand a stone, because like I said, that was part of my idea. You can't understand an arbitrary bit of paper because a stone isn't a real system. It's just an arbitrary hunk. But the Deathwatch Beetle, I feel like I can understand that. It's a beautiful biological system. And there could be experts in the Deathwatch Beetle. So what does he mean when he says, we cannot understand stones or the Deathwatch Beetle? I think that what he means by this, again, speaking for this tradition, is that there's no, as it were, perspective of the Deathwatch Beetle. There's no, I think he's taking it for granted that Deathwatch Beetles are like, there's no consciousness there. The lights aren't on. The Deathwatch Beetle might be a beautiful system, but it's like an elaborate machine. I think the thought is that that there's a kind of understanding that this tradition is talking about where it's not understanding things from a third-person point of view, but it's trying to get inside the first-person point of view of the agent or thing at issue. And if something doesn't have a first-person point of view, a perspective, then there's nothing to be accessed or gotten into. So stones don't have it. And he would claim, I think, that the Deathwatch Beetle doesn't have it. But, so this is, I think, the deeper point of view. When something has a perspective, there's a kind of understanding that you could only get when you don't look at it from a third-person point of view, but when you try to, as it were, access that person's perspective or that thing's perspective. And this is what this whole tradition, the Verstehen tradition, I think has been really trying to figure out. What would it mean to understand the life of the soul? What would it mean to understand your distinctive perspective? And a lot of it, unfortunately, so I've been reading this, I've been fascinated by it, but it's often very frustrating and misleading, I think. And I have this question, so what does it mean to access this first-person point of view? And how might the humanities help? one problem, as I say, it's been notoriously vague. So people talk, the general idea is something like you understand someone when you can get into that person's shoes. But again, that's just a metaphor. What does it mean to get into your shoes? Sometimes you have people like Herder talking about this process, I think, of Einfühlung. So feeling one's way into, which I believe in English was translated as empathy. So Collingwood spoke about trying to reenact the other person's thought processes, which he thought was especially important for historical understanding. Schleiermacher spoke about this divinatory method, where I try to divine what's going on in your consciousness. So especially when you use words like divinatory method, people get very nervous. They're like, what is this spooky thing? It's not objective, it's not scientific. It involves feeling, that's kind of weird. And you have objections like, so there might be the thought that when I try to understand you, I try to re-experience what you experience, re-feel what you feel. And one objection to this, I was trying to find the quote, I kind of ran out of time, but I think it was Peter Strawson who wrote that if this is the way you're thinking about history, say, as a humanistic discipline, this is a dead end. Bless you. History becomes impossible. If my goal is to re-feel what the ancient Greeks felt, or the ancient Aztecs, or people from a very different culture, it's not a discipline of thought. It's almost like a roll of the dice. I mean, you can't, whether in fact you manage to figure out what they really cared about and then you feel the same things they felt, you can't guarantee that. And many of the cultures you're trying to enter into, you might find you can't identify at all with the things they cared about. You might find it repugnant what they cared about. So if this historical understanding is a matter of feeling what the subjects felt, history becomes impossible in a way. So how do we think about this idea of getting into the perspective of another which doesn't involve like feeling with another? I just want to think differently in terms of, I want to say not re-feeling what other people felt in historical periods or so on, but I think that understanding is acquired when we can reconstruct the possibility space. So remember how I was thinking about possibility spaces of, say, the hammer, of the piece of paper. It's like what it's capable of, what it might do, how it might react to certain stimuli. But I think that the same idea, so this is the idea of like hammer, a piece of paper, it's not structure, but it's kind of what it's capable of, the possibility spaces lying in front of it. What I want to suggest is that the value of the humanities comes in when we could think of it, as it were, the possibility spaces that are projecting not from things like hammers or stones or pieces of paper, but the possibility spaces that lie in front of agents, of subjects, of people. This is how I'm thinking of their perspective. And that reconstructing that possibility space, but it's similar to what's going on in our apprehension of the natural world, when, as it were, we look at things according to what they might do. I think understanding other people involves, looking at it from their perspective, is like the arena of choices and concerns and cares which are laid out in front of them along certain priorities often, and that understanding that person's perspective is grasping how those cares and concerns are laid out. So this is an example of a person, but I think you could do it kind of for a culture in a way. So what was the possibility space like for ancient Greece? Or what's the possibility space like for contemporary England? Now, the possibility spaces of human beings, I think, are, you could think of them like the Hammer's possibility spaces, but of course they're very different and a lot more interesting. Because the possibility spaces that lie in front of me or you concern not just what's physically possible, but what we take to be admirable or like disdainful, what we take to be appropriate or inappropriate, what we take to be permissible or impermissible. Those are the kind of structures which guide, as it were, how I orient myself in the world. And I hesitate to do this just because it's very popular and crude. And yeah, I know some of you in the room are English, but okay, I'm going to use the English as a model. Okay, so this is reconstructing Big Ben, right? Although, actually, it's Andrew, right? Yeah. When I met you a moment ago, you just disconfirmed one of my hypotheses. So I'll tell you in a bit. Okay. So this is the possibility spaces lying in front of people are like their cares and concerns, what's permissible or impermissible, inbounds or out of bounds, what they take for granted. So I want to think, so the possibilities of people, again, are not just physical possibilities, but they're, so in philosophers' lingo, they're axiological, having to do with value. It's a value-laden possibility space where some things are more important or less important, some things are sacred, some things are profane, some things are very deeply valuable. And then you have rules structuring these possibility spaces. So again, the possibility spaces, I think, are tied to imagination, too. Maybe our culture has a limited imagination about what it might do, about the possibilities in front of it. Even about possibilities for, like, excellence or for nobility or for depravity. Okay, so just before I get to the English. As I'm thinking of it then, reconstructing the possibility space is not a matter of, so sometimes these debates get confused, I think, between sympathy and empathy. So let's think of sympathy as when you actually feel with another person. So these are your loves and concerns, and I have the same loves and concerns too. That, I think if that is the goal of history, say, that makes history impossible. Or just, it's a roll of the dice whether you in fact achieve those goals. But if you think of empathy as something like this, if you think of that as what Herder and others were talking about, not feeling with someone, but getting inside their possibility space and at least seeing how that was arrayed, what was important or unimportant, what was sacred and what was profane, then I don't think there's this problem about making history impossible. It's really trying to identify what people cared about, the rules that structured their cares. So again, if you could, in this way of thinking about it, so Humbert Humbert, the protagonist of Lolita, you could, as it were, get inside Humbert Humbert's perspective, you could reconstruct it, but you don't need to sympathize with it to understand, as it were, what his possibility space was like. There might be a kind of understanding that you could only get when you sympathize, bless you, but I don't think that's what history should be about. Okay, possibility. Okay, so here's, Andrew, do you know this book, Watching the English? Okay. So it's a bestseller in Britain. It's fascinating. You should read it. It's very thick. But it's called Watching the English, The Hidden Rules of English Behavior by someone at Oxford. Yes. So she's an anthropologist, and she's done a number of studies. She's an anthropologist, as it were, looking at her own culture. She's British. So she's done really fascinating studies of English pub life or racing culture in England, horse racing. And she has a lot of fascinating things to say. And this book it's about this thick. It's like a telephone book. It's her compendium of different rules that structure English life. So I've been in Cambridge for the year as a visitor, as I said, and so I have some perspective on it. My wife is British, so I have more perspective on it. And some of these things I thought were really fascinating. So lots of different rules. So I'll just give you an example of a couple, and then I'll say what these things mean. So she says one rule which governs English life, at least when you first meet someone, about the weather is you always agree. So somebody says to you, it's a bit chilly, isn't it? You have to say, it is, isn't it? Or they say, it's a lovely day, isn't it? You say, yes, quite. So the rule basically is you never disagree about the weather. And she says it's like a litany, it's like a liturgy. It's just a conversation starter, it's an icebreaker. But she thinks that she actually has a kind of a deeper value involved here. She also thinks, and this is where you were a counterexample, Andrew, she thinks that English people don't tell you their first names usually. So when I met him earlier, he said, hi, my name is Andrew. So, shoot. But often I found this is true. So you could be at a dinner party with someone, sitting next to someone for the whole evening, I think if they're English, and it might not occur to you to even exchange first names. Maybe at the end of the evening, if you've had a lovely time, you might say, oh, by the way, my name's Stephen. And you could say, oh, by the way, my name's Clemens. But she said that to use first names all the time, as she says, is cloyingly American. It's the kind of thing Americans do all the time, but British people, they refrain from it. Okay, so I could have used lots of different cultures. The basic, I could have used Dutch culture. I'm sure there are hidden rules that structure Dutch culture. It's actually, I think, a bit harder in America because America is a more heterogeneous country. I'm sure there are secret rules I'm not sure I follow as American. But what she fascinatingly says about it is that these are reflections, these set of rules are reflections of core English values. So she says the no-name rule reflects a deep English concern for privacy, that this is a core English value. And she says the agreement rule expresses a deep English concern for politeness or not making a fuss. So think of it, again, this is just, I happen to have been reading this book, I found it interesting, but any culture, I think, will have these different rules of behavior which will say not just what's possible or impossible, what's apt, inapt, polite, impolite, to be done, to be forbidden. And it often reflects kind of the deep values at issue. So to understand the English perspective is therefore to have a feel for which of these rules are most fundamental, which are more negotiable, why some are more fundamental than others because of the values they embody. So perhaps if the no-name rule is apt of the English, they have a much deeper concern for privacy than perhaps Americans do. So it's not like Americans wouldn't understand the concern for privacy, but if you think of these values as like hierarchically ordered in given societies, is it 40? Almost? Okay, I think close. Then understanding the possibility space is going to be understanding how these different values are structured, which are more important than others. Okay, so that's what I suggest occupying the perspective of another involves. Seeing or mapping out these possibility spaces. So if you think of it in terms of the lines, like the hammer line, I think the possibility spaces of, say, the English or the ancient Greeks and so on, it's not going to be pure lines. It's going to be layered and multi-dimensional and angular, all very odd. It's going to make it very hard to understand other people. But I also think that understanding is a matter of degree. So I doubt that I can purely understand another culture. I doubt that I could purely understand another person, perfectly understand another person. I'm not even sure I perfectly understand myself. But these things are matters of degrees where we can understand more or less what the possibility space is like. Okay, let me just get to, this is kind of the concluding thing. So the humanities, perspectives, and wisdoms. So how do the humanities contribute to this appreciation of possibility spaces, and how do they contribute to wisdom? Well, if the goal is to just think of literature, if the goal is to try to occupy the possibility space when we're trying to understand another person, occupy their perspective, which means their possibility space, and see how it's structured, see what their cares and concerns are, and what the most significant cares and concerns were, then in a way, the novels are, again, they're not indispensable, but they're marvelous, I think, ways of helping us to appreciate the possibility spaces of other people. So what it would be like to be, what the cares and concerns of in Toni Morrison's Beloved, you know, a runaway slave in 1850s or 1860s America who was so distraught by her possibilities that she killed her own daughter to save her from slavery. Or the perspective of a 16-year-old New Yorker in Catcher in the Rye who's, again, kind of fraught by concerns for innocence. There's a kind of worldliness, allowing you to appreciate what the cares and concerns of that space is like. The perspective of a whaler in the 19th century, Ishmael in Moby Dick. Again, literature is extraordinary in that ability to, it's not a third-person perspective we take up. It's a way in which we could inhabit the perspective of another. And again, you might not literally come to sympathize, like in the Humbert Humbert case, in the Lolita case, but you can get a sense, as I say, of what it's like to be in this position. So already, I think this is a first-person point of view, something we can maybe only access if we try to figure out what someone's cares and concerns are, and we try to figure that out from their point of view. And again, some things will be just beyond us, like perhaps it's just beyond me to know what it's like to be a woman or what it's like to be African American, in some sense. Perhaps some of these perspectives are just closed to me, but there are some gains we can make too. Okay, what's the connection to wisdom? Well, what is wisdom? This is just a few more slides, Renee. I think the wise person is someone who knows how to live well, and a major element of knowing how to live well is knowing what's more or less important for well-being. So I could give you my whole theory about it, but let me just give you an example. So someone we take to be, say, it's hard to maybe come to consensus about who is wise. Often there are short lists of people like Jesus and Socrates and the Buddha. But there's more consensus about who's not wise. So if you were to read Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich, someone who throughout the short story or the novella, his main concerns were impressing his bourgeois friends with the kind of furniture he had in his house and spending as much time in amusing card games as possible, ignoring his wife and children as much less important. And at the end of the novel, or the novella, it just becomes, he seems like a paradigm example of a fool, someone with misplaced priorities. So, and I think he came to a kind of wisdom about how mistaken, how misguided these priorities were. So the wise person knows more or less what's important for well-being. So what I think is that what literature does is that it gives you these different possibility spaces of different values that could be important, different emphases, different values, different ways of expressing values or visions of the good. You might come to appreciate, as I say, the dignity or courage of certain ways of living or acting, different ways of expressing it. Maybe every culture has some concern for the value of friendship or love, but maybe this culture expresses that value in a particularly heightened or impressive way. And exposing yourself to more cultures through history or literature helps to reveal that. So, and I should say here an important word. So I would want to say, epistemically, just as a philosopher, you could say, is reading literature either necessary or sufficient for achieving this wisdom? I don't think it's necessary. I also don't think it's sufficient, right? You could read this literature and not get these benefits. But again, we often talk about the wise person as having wide experience of the world. Having wide experience of the world is also helpful to wisdom, but it's not sufficient for wisdom. There are many lessons to be learned, but not everyone can learn them. Okay, so it's reading literature versus the study of literature. There are maybe 3 or 4 more slides. I just want to say, so what I've been talking about is basically the epistemic benefits of reading, but this is a conference about the nature of the humanities, and it's slightly different, right? The study of the humanities versus reading books, studying books versus reading books. So why study books? And by my lights, it's because you have experts in these fields help to reveal, as it were, the hidden presuppositions of these value spaces. Really, they might be there, it might be obvious, we might inhabit this world, but we might not be clear about what the presuppositions are of this world. They could be presuppositions that the subject himself or herself is unaware of. They could be cultural presuppositions or gender presuppositions or colonial presuppositions. So I think that what the real study of literature would do would be to bring an element of critique and evaluation. Here's this possibility space. Let's talk about how, let's critique it. Let's think about its potential. Now that's, maybe in literature departments, I don't know, people have become more wary about that project, but philosophers do that all the time, especially in ethics. We think about the different ways of living. We think about different values, different ways people have instantiated values. And it's not just possibility spaces, but we critique and we evaluate. And I think that's an important part of wisdom. Philosophy, I think, also expands our sense of possibility. So in that way is tied to understanding. But that's all a big claim. So this is what I hope to have shown. This is the last slide. That the objects of understanding are possibility spaces, that the possibility spaces of human beings are value-laden, that the humanities enrich our appreciation of these possibility spaces. They give us they allow us the humanities history, the study of other cultures, study of literature, allows us to see these different ways of living, and what philosophy helps us to do is to evaluate and critique them. And that this is, when this is done well, it offers the promise of greater wisdom, by which I mean not something fancy or mysterious, but just greater insight into how to live well. It can. It doesn't guarantee it, but it can. That's it.